Hi, Carrie.
Hi.
How are you?
Good. Do you always look like this?
Yeah, sure. I just got out of bed like this. Yeah. No, I no, I like your channel. I want to make it look good. So yes, you bet.
Canadians, they're nice. They're NATO, and they have freedom of the press. And I say that because one of the people who explains things on TV in Canada is with us today. We've got Anthony Seaboyer. And Anthony, before I go on, I know that you're German Canadian, but you're not French Canadian, so it's not Seaboyer. I reached out to Anthony and said I wanted to talk to him on TikTok, and he said yes. We're really lucky. Maybe that's because we went to university together. We also both worked at the German Council on Foreign Relations. Right now, though, Anthony's in Canada and he shows up on TV there a lot. So we're going to ask him some questions that have to do with Ukraine today. Some countries like Germany, where I am, were very slow to respond, and close neighbors, Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, the Baltic states, they were much quicker to respond and showed strong support. What is the feeling now in Canada?
Well, Canada is a very strongly value-based democracy, where I would say our values are somewhere between the Atlantic, somewhere between Europe and North America and the United States, if you want. So Canadians also have a very good education system and a good media system. So they're very well informed of what Russia is doing, what Russia did in 2014 and ongoing. There is a high level of knowledge compared to many other countries about what's happening. And so there was a lot of pressure on the government to take action, and there still is. And the government itself, though, which is quite value-based, also wanted to act. That said, there are quite a number of constraints, particularly budget constraints. So we're a very large country with, though, very high costs for general infrastructure because of the size. For example, Germany fits 37 times into Canada, just to give us an idea of the size. So the budgets are comparatively small because we only have like about more than a third of the population of Germany. And so budgets are tight. So there was certainly pressure, and there is even more pressure, I would argue. It's continuing, like we saw at the UN votes. If anything, support for Ukraine has increased. It was big initially, and it's increased more. This is also based on the fact that we have a strong Canadian-Ukrainian community in Canada, which is organizing fairly well and is getting a lot of support from all Canadians.
I wondered if you would mention that. You also touched on information and education. And we know that even though the front line is in eastern Ukraine right now, but with hybrid warfare, the information war is taking place everywhere. How effective has the Kremlin been in influencing or trying to influence public opinion in Canada, and how are they doing that?
Well, it's really hard to say how effective information warfare is in general because we can't measure it, right? We can measure how many people have seen things, we can measure how many people have engaged, interacted with things, but with posts or other forms of information distribution, but we can't really see if it's led to behavioral change or not. It's really hard to prove that. That's something that experts are working on to prove. That said, nevertheless, it's clear Canada is very directly targeted regularly and has been for quite a while by Russian disinformation campaigns, by Russian propaganda campaigns. Russia has set up a network of like-minded people and even paid influencers that have set up an echo chamber, artificial echo chamber, like in many countries, to target certain topics when interested. And there was a very famous attack on the Canadian foreign minister about 2 years ago from Russian sources. So there is a network here. There's, depending on what some numbers you believe, there's up to 500 or even more paid actors, Russian actors in Canada that act on behalf of the government. There's different reports about the actual numbers, but there is certainly a network, a very clear network. Canada is being targeted. I would argue they've never went full out so far, so there's much more capability than we've actually seen them use. And we're not, of course, as much targeted as the United States and other countries are, but Canadians are very well aware of this network. And there's also other networks that are using disinformation, particularly Chinese, that are targeting Canadians. So how does this happen? This happens often through social media accounts that then in artificially generated echo chambers will echo each other, that then Russian media will report on, that even the foreign minister and others pick up, and then Canadian media, because the Russian foreign minister or defense minister speaks about this, then also pick up. So these are echo. And then we know it's always challenged with disinformation. The actual news, the actual piece of disinformation, which is not news, of course, will get a lot of attention, but the debunking of it afterwards will get zero, because we've always seen this 1,000 times, that it was just a narrative, false narrative. So we're vulnerable, but If you look at research on vulnerability disinformation, the higher the education level, the better the knowledge of the population, the less vulnerable to disinformation campaigns Canadian or population the population is. And we've had good campaigns. The government's working on, very effectively working on improving campaigns and learning from countries like Finland, who have been really good at combating disinformation.
Right now, we've got October 19th when you and I are talking. About 2 hours ago, Russia's President Vladimir Putin introduced martial law in his illegally annexed regions of Ukraine. When he annexed them, Canada cracked down and applied more sanctions at the end of September. How do you think the sanctions are doing their job?
Well, that's a very difficult question. And what does doing their job really mean? We're at unprecedented times here. I think they've certainly had an effect. If this is going to be enough or not is very hard to say. I mean, Russia has not really stopped its actions, and we're seeing no signs whatsoever of the Kremlin or Putin backing off. This also has to do, though, that he doesn't care much about lives, Russian lives or Ukrainian lives or anybody's lives beyond those that really directly are necessary or essential for him. I would say the sanctions are a good step. I'm happy that we're seeing them. I'm surprised initially. I wasn't surprised of the resolution and how countries are sticking to them. I think we need more, though. We need to show, and this is, again, not only about Ukraine, this is about showing all of the countries, not about Russia either, that if countries go down these steps, these are the consequences, these are the costs it's going to be that they're going to have to face. So this is really not just about Ukraine and Russia. This is about what is our rule-based international order. And for that, we need to think about more effective, smart sanctions than we have right now.
When you and I were at university, we were still talking about Cold War paradigms because that was what we had to work with. And we were looking for new ways to think about politics. But a lot of what's happening here of reminders of the Cold War. However, what's different, in my opinion, is China. So what kind of paradigms should we be using here? How do you think about this?
Well, for me, technology is a key difference to the Cold War, particularly social media. The fact that countries can't seal themselves off from information the way this was done during the Cold War. So China is penetrated, North Korea is penetrated by Western information. Certainly Russia is, because there's ways to evade the firewalls and other measures set in place. So that's a key difference. But there are a lot of similarities too. So if you trace, for example, Russian activities, the doctrine, what they're doing has not changed so much, how they're doing has changed. And that is largely information, basically a strong focus on information. In terms of China, they've had a policy of informationization, which is to set very heavily on information warfare and increasing information flow domestically and anywhere else, but also controlling information flow. And this is where Russia and China are very different. China sees the free flow of information anywhere in the world as a national security threat. They try to control information about China particularly, but also about democracies anywhere in the world. They do this, for example, by buying Hollywood companies, production companies, having Hollywood movies modified slightly towards their political interests and influencing what we see in our TVs, on our TV screens every night, as one way of doing this. Buying social media companies, having them owned by Chinese controlled actors influencing content. There's so many ways. Differences are there are key differences between Russia and China, though, and their cooperation is also not as good as it would look in many ways. There's not a lot of love lost. One key difference is that China is dependent on the West buying Chinese products. Most products that we're using, many products that we're using, are built in China. And to have their promise of growth that they need in China to keep the system alive, they need us to buy their products. They're not interested in chaos in the sense that Russia is. They're not interested in the same kind of outcome in the West as Russia is. Very different. And we'll have to keep in mind, China trades 10 times more with the West than it does with Russia. So there's a clear interest in keeping relationships as much as possible good with the West, which is one reason why there hasn't been significant delivery of weapons and there hasn't been a real cooperation like Putin had hoped for over the Ukraine war. And we're also seeing there changes, fortunately, slow changes of more and more questions being asked. And even Putin admits that the Chinese leadership has severe questions about what Russia is actually doing in Ukraine right now.
Canadians, they have a neighbor to the south, the United States. And in the past administration wasn't always predictable when it came to foreign policy. Is the United States now with the Biden administration a better partner for the challenges that the Russian invasion of Ukraine is bringing?
For us as Canadians, absolutely, Biden's policies are much more in line with Canadian values, like we saw before from Obama. It's been hard for us, for sure, under Trump. Trump declared Canada a national security threat, even over production of cars and similar activities. So, yeah, I think very clearly the policies or the closeness that always existed or has existed for many decades between Canada and the U.S. has certainly come back under Biden. There's a lot more cooperation. And yeah, but we also know what happened in 2016 can happen very much again. And I think woke up a lot of people to possibilities of what kind of security measures we have to put in place ourselves in case a similar actor again gets elected in the States.
Ukraine has been trying to be a member of NATO for a very long time, and Canadians are known for being really nice. Uh, is it hard for Canadians to position themselves there, especially with the Ukrainian diaspora, and at the same time what the consequences of Ukraine and NATO would be?
Well, I can only speak as a scientist, of course, from the research I do. And I mean, the research is really clear, right? There's criteria to join NATO, and one of those is that your territory is not disputed. Which makes it interesting why Putin would even claim that Ukraine could join NATO, because based on the fact that parts were annexed in 2014, there was already no possibility for Ukraine to become a NATO member.
Wait a minute, though, Anthony. This is a big argument I get into with a lot of people. 1955, Germany joins NATO. Their territory was technically disputed, too. I mean, Germany didn't even acknowledge diplomatically the existence of East Germany. Neither did any other countries until, what, 72 or 73? So basically, that's kind of a fudgy argument. I mean, it's an argument which makes sense. You don't want to pick the person on your kickball team that's going to cause problems right away. But it's not really a rule. It's just kind of knowledge, isn't it? That
Well, as far as I'm concerned, in my research that I did, it looks very much to be a strong rule. And it makes sense in the sense that you don't want to be bought into or forced into a conflict. So members, as you know, would have to all agree on such a measure, and most will not be want to pulled into a war. So I think that's why that rule is set up and makes sense. But there's also other ways to have very close cooperation with Ukraine. And we've seen Canada, for example, training Ukrainian forces for many years very effectively. And I would argue that part of the success the Ukrainian forces are having right now is due to the training that was given by others, but also by Canada to Ukrainian forces. So there's many ways to support Ukraine. And again, I want to say this is not just about supporting Ukraine, this is supporting general rules-based international order, which Canada is highly dependent on as a multilateral actor that's a mid-power and needs organizations like NATO, but also the UN, basically to guarantee its security. My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I think you just gave a master class in how to do interviews. Now let me shut off.